Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Suddenly Human, which is episode 4 of season 4 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video I cover the 4th season episode Suddenly Human. So Suddenly Human is the episode in which the Enterprise comes to aid of a Tellurian battle cruiser to aid medical attention. However, they find that one of the teenagers trainees on board is in fact a human, and so the Enterprise refuses to turn over this human to the Terralians, even though the human insists that the Terralian captain is his father. They discovered that he is in fact a long-lost son or grandson of a prestigious Starfleet admiral, and so they try to get him to realize his human side. Particularly Picard takes charge in being a father figure to him. However, this backfires when the human Jomo tries to kill Picard, and then Picard, while his adoptive father, Captain Indar, is ready to go to war over the fact that they won't turn his son over to them, Picard realizes that it was a mistake trying to force him to be human and decides to give the boy back to his adoptive father on the Tellurian ship. So, last week in the episode Brothers, I talked about the writing staff of season 4, and how it was different than season 3. And I mentioned that this was the first time, this year was the year that Jerry Taylor joined the writing staff. However, I said in that video that I wasn't sure if she was a part of the writing staff yet or not. I didn't know which episode she joined for, and alas, it is this one. She joined for this episode. She wrote this episode and then was hired based on the job she did for this episode. And as I mentioned, she was basically Michael Pillar's right-hand woman, sort of in charge of the writing staff and working more directly with them to break episodes down and overseeing them, even though Michael Pillar was, at the top, oversaw her. And then, of course, there's also Rick Berman, who had to approve the scripts as well. But anyway, and of course, she would go on to be a prominent producer in the Star Trek franchise. She would help create Star Trek Voyager and be the showrunner on that show for several seasons. In fact, she was the showrunner on Next Generation for its last 2 seasons, I believe, or at least its final season. So, yeah, she becomes a well-known producer in Star Trek. Anyway, the funny thing about it is, when I was watching, after I watched this episode, before I knew who wrote it, I forgot to look up who wrote the episode. And I was thinking to myself, I bet you this was a Jerry Taylor script, because it just seems like her style. And sure enough, it was. And why do I say that? Because, and I think she had a huge influence on season 5 in particular, that she tends to do the sort of character-based stuff, and especially favors stuff where adult characters mentor a younger kid. That seems to be a cliche in a lot of drama art house stuff, and she seems to gravitate towards that. And so the whole thing with Picard having the mentor Jomo, or is it Jomo or Jamo? I don't know. Anyway, her trying to mentor him, I thought, wow, that really seems like a Jerry Taylor script. And sure enough, it was. Now, it was based off of a spec script that was actually submitted in season 3. And I talked about this in my writing video about how the writers on staff would there would be sent a whole bunch of spec scripts that would have a summary, and it would be screened by these initial readers who had to read thousands of scripts, and they would select a few for the writers to look at, but the writers would then take their pile and then select a few of those that they thought would actually be made into an episode. And apparently this one was chosen by Hans Bendler, I always say he's Boimler like Lower Decks, Hans Bendler and Richard Manning, who were a writing duo, who left at the end of season 3, but apparently they wrote a summary for this script. It's one of the ones they chose, and apparently got picked up for season 4, but written by Jerry Taylor, and I believe there was a co-writer on this episode with Jerry Taylor. Let's see, John Whipley. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's probably a freelance. Anyway, so when I was wondering if she had if Jerry Taylor was in the writing staff in the previous episode Brothers, the answer is actually yes, maybe, I don't know. But if she was hired for this episode, then yes, because even though this episode came out after Brothers, it was actually written before Brothers. Apparently this episode was the second episode written and produced and filmed for season 4. So you got Best of Both Worlds Part 2, then you had Suddenly Human, then you had Brothers, and then you had Family. So now I talked about in my revisit for Family, the reason why that was filmed 4th but aired 2nd is because they made Suddenly Human and Brothers, and Michael Piller was like, this doesn't feel right. Things shouldn't just go back to normal like that for Picard. So let's do this episode that deals with the aftermath of Best. So he thought of that after these first 2 episodes were made. But of course it takes place right after Best of Both Worlds, so they had to air it before. So that makes sense why they aired that out of order. Why they switched up Suddenly Human and Brothers, that I don't know. Yeah. I'm not sure about that one. But anyway, I don't know. I never really thought much of this episode. If I'm going to be honest, I'm not that huge into Jerry Taylor's writing. As I said, I'm sure she's a great writer and contributed a lot of great stuff, overseeing the staff, and really helped hammer down the character stories. But the episodes she personally writes, as I say, they tend to be this kids mentored by one of the adult characters cliche, and that's basically what this is. And I was never a big fan of this episode. In fact, and this is something I'll get into more as we go through season 4. That first of all, I talked about this many times before. Season 4 is the first season of Star Trek that I saw on reruns, and I saw these episodes multiple times. So I saw this season the most. So for me, and this is just my personal take, I can't help but have a more sort of tired, I've seen these a billion times before feel, even more so than other seasons, was season 4. Because it was the first season that I watched, and I watched it repeatedly before I saw even seasons 1, 2, or 3, especially season 3, which took me almost a year before I saw that. So it is odd that it came out and was made after season 3, yet for me, my messed up way of watching it, it came first, and I'm more sick of the episodes. And so that's why I guess I don't like season 4. That's part of the reason why I don't like it as much as everyone else does. I still think it's a really good season, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of really good episodes in it. But there's also a lot of mediocre episodes. And there's a lot of episodes that I think of when I think of season 4, when I think, yeah, it's kind of mediocre. This is one of them. There's more that I'll get to down the line, but this is definitely one where I thought, yeah, this is season 4. Where I don't really feel that way with the season 3. Even some of the lesser season 3 episodes like The Price or Menage a Troy, but even like the average season 3 episode, I definitely have a higher opinion of it. I'm more excited to see it. And I don't think, oh yeah, it's just this mediocre stuff. Not that I think it's horrible, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of like mediocre episodes that stick out to me for season 4. Now, granted, this is not one of the ones I was totally sick of. That again, I'll get to later in season 4. I guess for some reason that's because I don't think that the syndicated. Because remember, I was watching this in 1992 or 91. It started in late 91 and carried over to 92, and this is the days before streaming services and even the days before DVD collections. My only option was to watch whatever the syndicated channel, local channel I was watching, just chose to show me. And for some reason, they chose to show me season 4 repeatedly, and I don't think they went in order. I think, I don't know, I could be mistaken, but I think there were certain episodes, particularly that aired later in season 4, that they decided to show over and over and over again. But maybe that was just my impression. Hard to say, it was so long ago. But anyway, so Suddenly Human wasn't one of those episodes, but it was one of the ones that I thought was, that I did see a lot, because I saw all the ones in season 4 a lot, except for Redemption, because they actually saved that until they showed season 5. So I didn't actually see Redemption until season 5 hit syndication like a year later. But anyway, that's another story. But other than that, yeah, I've seen all the episodes of season 4 more than I've seen all the episodes of any other season. But yeah, this episode was, as I said, and when I had to watch it for just now for this review, I wasn't looking forward to it. I'm like, oh god. Alright, but again, I always try to go in to these viewings with a very open mind, with a very analytical mind, trying to sort of really think hard about the episode, and also be open, try to disregard my preconceived notions of this episode, because part of it is probably due to the fact I was sick of it. So I try as much as I can to look at it with fresh eyes. And I think I did like it better by doing that. I think I did appreciate it more on what it was trying to do. The one thing, and I guess I'll start with this, even though it's the ending, because the one thing that why I didn't really like this episode that much when I was growing up, it's because I hated the ending. I didn't like the fact that they gave Jomo, or Jono, whatever his name is, I should look this up. I didn't like the fact that they gave him back to the Talarians. Yeah, I don't know. It didn't sit right with me. I'm like, well, he's human. You should keep him with the humans. Now, I think of it a bit more nuanced now. That was sort of my 12-year-old, like, gut initial reaction. Oh, it is Jono. Okay, there we go. Anyway, yeah, Jono. So anyway, that was my initial reaction, was to think, well, this is stupid. I hate this ending. They shouldn't give him back. But analyzing it now, of course, I see that it's, I don't know, it's not so much that I agree with his decision. It's not like this is the clear-cut decision. Of course, they should have done this. It's way more complicated. Like, it is tough. It's like there are no easy answers in this situation. Because on the one hand, you have, I get what they're saying here, that he was raised as a Talarian. He has a father who loves him. He thinks of himself as Talarian. His whole culture is Talarian. So why are you going to rip him out of that culture and force him to go somewhere he shouldn't? But on the other hand, you see that he was, he has a grandmother who thought he was dead, who desperately wants to meet him, and that he's starting to remember the trauma of his parents dying and being taken away as a young boy, and he's starting to experience what it is to be human. And so that made me think, well, if he goes back to them, he's probably different now. He's probably not as Tellurian as he used to be because of Picard exposing him to his heritage and his human culture, and he's not going to be able to live that. He's not going to be able to explore his heritage, and that's a very bad thing. But ultimately, where I fall, I think that, as I said, I don't think there is a right answer here. I don't think there's an easy answer. Therefore, the right conclusion is to allow him to choose. So I think that's the right answer, and that is ultimately what they did. Now you might argue against, well, obviously he tried to kill Picard, so if he would have stayed with the Federation, he would have been imprisoned. So that also affects it as well. Should he be forced to, maybe he wouldn't be arrested. Maybe he wouldn't have to be in prison. Maybe he would just go into house arrest. But still, the fact that he tried to kill Picard because he felt like he was betraying his adopted father. I think that also plays a factor. But I think the biggest factor is that he wanted. He should decide. Because I don't think there is a right answer here. So the right answer is let him choose. Now, at first, it did feel like he was being kind of pressured into choosing to go with the Tellurians. Because, and I don't blame this on Captain Endor, or this isn't the forest moon of Endor, but anyway, sorry. Or is it pronounced differently, like Endor or something? I don't know. But anyway, I don't blame him, the Ewok guy. I don't blame him for it because he just had that natural reaction, like what would you? I'm your father. Why would you even consider going with the humans? It's more of heartbreak. It's less of like a bully trying to intimidate him into going with me. Going with him is like, oh, you have to go with me. How dare you not go with me? It's more of, you can see that he really does love him. And the fact that Jono hesitated was like, hurt him. It was like painful. He was like, you don't really want to stay here, do you? But I am of the mind that if Jono said, yes, I want to stay here, then he would respect that. Which is, of course, what Starfleet was banking on, what Picard was banking on. He was like, okay, let's try to get him to want to stay, because if he does, then Endor has to respect his wishes, which I believe he would. But it was clear that even though Jono was conflicted, I think it was very clear that he did not want to stay, that he wanted to go home. He just had a lot of conflicting emotions, which is what worries me, because when he goes back to this warlike culture, he's going to maybe appear weak because of what he experienced. But maybe if Endor is in fact a good father they make him out to be, he will be understanding of this and help him work through it in their own warrior culture way. So I don't feel that simplicity that I first felt when I thought, well, this is dumb, he should stay with the humans. And it's weird that I had that gut reaction, because now I see that he never should have been taken away in the first place just because he was human, and Beverly jumped to conclusions about that, oh, he's been tortured, whatever. And I've heard a lot of people criticize her for that, but I think that's understandable. I think what you have to understand is that they don't see the Tellurians in a very positive light. They see them as a warlike species who are often going around slaughtering innocent children, and so she definitely has that bias, whether rightfully or wrongly, and so that's why she would jump to that conclusion. But once it was proven that he wasn't being mistreated and he was in fact loved, I think it was very clear that Picard should have returned him immediately instead of trying to manipulate him into wanting to stay, which is actually kind of shady the more I think of it. Even though it was working and it possibly could have worked, it's still kind of messed up if you think about it. But the funny thing is that this is very similar to a Deep Space Nine episode called Cardassians, in which you also have a situation where you have a Cardassian boy who was raised by Bajoran parents, and he was raised by Bajoran parents to hate Cardassians because, of course, the Cardassians enslaved the Bajoran people and tortured them through 50 years of occupation. And so they wouldn't think of Cardassians in a positive way, but they recognized that the boy was innocent. And again, the adoptive father definitely did love him and wasn't torturous to him. Like some of the Cardassians assume, they probably tortured him and took out their frustrations of the occupation on him. But that doesn't seem to be true. And it seems to be very clearly be the case that his Bajoran parents did love him. But then they uncovered there was a conspiracy where he was taken away against his will from a prominent Cardassian political figure in an effort to create a scandal and diminish his name. And so he never should have been. He wasn't an orphan in the first place, and he never should have been raised on Bajor. That was due to, the scheme, and so you could see it as correcting the scheme by returning him to his rightful parents. But in that situation, I come to the same conclusion I come in this episode. In fact, even more so, more forcefully, that they should have let him stay with his adoptive parents. And I'll get to that episode when I get to it, when I get to Deep Space Nine. But my conclusion, I've said before in other videos, was that young Cardassian boy probably killed himself when he was forced to go back and live with the people that he absolutely despises. He probably killed himself. So way to go for that decision. They definitely made the wrong one there. But here, I actually think they made the right decision. Now, let me talk a bit about the Talarians. First of all, I hate the name. Apparently, they did it purposely to call back to the Arsenal of Freedom, because in that episode they mentioned a Talarian ship, but we didn't actually never seen or heard of who the Talarians actually were. And so when the script came, the aliens were originally called something else, but then they were like, let's actually call them the Talarians, because that's something mentioned in previous episode. I think it was Michael Akuda who came up with that idea. But anyway, I still hate the name because there's so many species that are very similar to it. The Talarians, the Talelians, there's the Tellarites, the Terrans. I don't know, there's just so many that all sound like that. And so I think they should have. The other name, I couldn't know how to pronounce it, but it started with like a PY or something. That they should have went with that instead. I appreciate them trying to do some continuity and do a callback that nobody would recognize, but that's not a good name. There's too many. I always get them all confused. And there's probably more aliens that have similar names that I'm not even remembering. There's too many. So I hate that. But the other thing about them is, I remember reading an article about season 4, and how I think it might have been the Star Trek Companion. When they were describing season 4, they were talking about how all the things that season 4 did. They mentioned that they introduced 2 new alien species, the Talarians and the Cardassians. And what you have to realize is that when I read that article, it was before I realized the Cardassians were brought back. So as far as I was concerned, they were just a one-off alien as well, even though Ensign Ro had come out, but I missed like the first part of season 5, so I didn't realize that the Cardassians were in Ensign Ro. I didn't know that they were brought back yet, and this was before season 6 or before Deep Space Nine, so Ensign Ro was the only time it was brought back, and I missed that one. So as far as I was concerned, they were a one-off alien. But when I read that article, I'm like, no. These aliens are not the same. It's very clear. The Cardassians I fell in love with immediately. Like, I thought they really worked as a species, as an adversary. And I'm like, please bring them back. Please bring them back. And that, as I said, this was before I even realized that they had already brought them back. I had no idea that they did, and I had no idea that they would. I was just like, please, please bring the Cardassians back. But the Tellurians, I was just like, one-off alien species that doesn't mean anything. Don't bring them back. They're boring. They suck. So I kind of took issue with this article comparing the two, like, oh, these two new interesting species. I was like, no, one interesting species and one that's a one-off that sucks that we never should see again, and in fact won't see again. Both of them are the cases where they imply there was a previous war with Starfleet, which kind of annoys me, especially in this episode, that there's, and in both cases, the aliens, the enemies, the adversaries, their ship is inferior in technology. Of course, they'll retcon this with the Cardassians later on in order to make them a more formidable adversary, which I talked about in other videos, how I don't mind that they did that because it makes them more interesting. In fact, I don't like the fact that they introduced both these alien species to be easily defeated and just be like flies to the Enterprise, insects to the Enterprise. And that was also annoying in this episode, how Endor kept threatening to go to war, but Worf and everyone made it very clear that they were harmless, that they couldn't do any harm to the Enterprise whatsoever. The only risk is that, we might be forced to kill them. But then again, if they go to war, they could always attack unarmed outposts like they did with Jeremiah. So they could still do some harm. Or the Federation would at least have to exert some resources in order to stop them from doing any harm. So it would war would still be something to be avoided. I just think like the episode would have been way more interesting had they actually been formidable. And then there's the culture of the Tellurians. They're just like generic warrior race, patriotic warrior race. They're essentially the Kazon. I guess they're different than the Kazon because the Kazons were divided and had sex, where this seems to be a more unified species, more like the Klingons. But other than that, they might as well be Klingons or freaking Kazon. They're just generic, is what I'm saying. Whereas the Cardassians weren't. The Cardassians were instantly fascinating to me, instantly very like deceitful, but in a different way than the Romulans, and they just seemed very interesting. Maybe it was Mark Alimo probably had a lot to do with why I liked them so much. Whereas the actor in this episode who played Captain Ender, I think I remember seeing him in other things. He looks very familiar, but he wasn't very good. That's really my conclusion that I draw, that he really did make this species come off as flat and uninteresting. So that's another reason why I always looked on this episode as forgettable. Now, as far as Picard being forced to be the mentor, I did find this a little contrived and a little silly, and at least they wanted to address the fact that Picard was terrible with children, which was true in seasons 1 and 2, but actually in season 3, especially the episode The Bonding, we saw him actually being quite well with children. Which, to be fair, I think his portrayal in The Bonding was kind of out of character for him, but here he's gone back to not knowing what to do with children, and I found that whole storyline to be very cliche and very derivative of a lot of other storylines that did the same thing, and they would hit like the typical cliches, like when Jonah went into his room and they picked up a knife, the Klingon knife, and Picard's like, "Don't touch that!" And then he picked up this other like statue thing, and Picard's just like, freaking out, and Jonah catches on. But the worst part of it is when Jonah was listening to his Tellurian music and blasting it when Picard came home, and it was so obvious. And this is something that really made me cringe when I first saw this episode. It was so obvious that they were trying to equated to teenagers blasting like heavy metal music and annoying their parents, and that's something I used to do around this age. Maybe not heavy metal, but definitely loud, maybe grunge, Nirvana, music like that. I used to blast full level in my room, or Nine Inch Nails. Not when I first saw this episode, but eventually. And I was like, yeah, they're just trying to do that cliche of who's blasting heavy metal music. And I thought it was so dumb. Like, I really didn't like it. But the one good thing I will say about the storyline is, and this is the one good thing I'll say about Jerry Taylor, and maybe this is why, the fact that she wrote this episode is why this worked out so well, is that Troy is actually written well in this episode. She's actually given something to do, even though she lets Picard take center stage in, dealing with Jono. And the reason why she makes sense is because, he doesn't respect women because they come from a patriarchal society. And so he would show no respect for her, and there's no way that she could reach him, but Picard could. I thought it was dumb, by the way, that he wanted to sleep in Picard's room. Like, that's stupid. But anyway, yeah, so Troy, the way she used her, she did come off as an expert. Like, she actually knew what she was doing, and using her empathic abilities to sense what they were feeling. Oh my god. So they were actually writing her correctly for once. And I love the scene where Picard calls her into a ready room, tries to convince her to let someone else deal with Jono. She was like, never before have I heard an explanation so well rehearsed. Like, that was a really good scene. Like, I thought that was great, and I thought it was written well for her. So that's kudos to the episode for that. But other than that, it was just brings up a somewhat interesting moral dilemma, but ultimately it was just a hodgepodge of cliches that we've seen before. Anyway, I want to give a shout out to everyone who supports me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It does help me continue with the channel. I'm just very thankful for all those who support me. So I will give a shout out to Antarius, Tatson, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Valls, Alessandro Migalisio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neilhouse. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So we have a few patron comments for this episode. First comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, while watching this episode, I was wondering why I gave Suddenly Human a high rating. I agree with Picard to let Jono return home to his adopted father Endor. The Picard speech elevated the episode from an average episode to a good one. So Michael Eddington was wrong about Starfleet, the Federation, being worse than the Borg. Season 4 is the family season of Star Trek. Maybe Michael Piller realized that Star Trek was his family while on that beach he mentioned in the DVD extras. I like my theory better, that all the staffed writers during the off-season watched These Are the Days of Our Lives. Picard has an artificial heart that was never even mentioned. Oh yeah, I forgot. Beverly wasn't in season 2 and must have missed the duct tape. My rating is 7 times Picard lost to Jono at whatever that game is called out of 10. I believe that was racquetball. That looked like some futuristic version of racquetball anyway. That's what Bashir and O'Brien would go over to play in DS9. Yeah, I've heard. I watched this thing. The Blu-ray has a feature about how season 4 of TNG is the family season. And I was thinking, no, it's actually season 7. Season 7 very clearly is the family season. They kept bringing everyone's relative on like almost every episode. So I think that has season 4 beat. However, between Family, Brothers, this episode, and Legacy, that is a streak of a lot of family episodes, but it's all front-loaded. Oh, there's also Reunion because Worf meets his son. Okay, so that's another one. But again, that's all at the front. That's all at the start of the season. I think once you get past those episodes like Clues, Devil's Due, Identity Crisis, like none of those are family related. Nth Degree, Cupid, none of that's family related. So I think Mind's Eye, none of it. In Theory, so it's all like front loaded. It's like you got a run of episodes at the very start of season 4 that are all family related, but then the rest of the season they drop it. Whereas season 7 is kind of sprinkled in throughout the entire season, and there's more of them. So I think that honor would go to season 7. But just my humble, this is also, of course, a string of episodes about family for sure. Anyway, next comment is from Brandon Neal Howells, who says, "More Federation superiority. Sigh. My main question about this episode is, where are all the men? If Jonah was raised in a patriarchal society and will not respond to women, why are the only men we see him with are Picard and a very briefly Worf? I think Worf and Jono could have traded experiences and bonded, but no, Jono must be paired with Picard because Jono responds best to a captain. Gasp. Picard is uneasy around children and is that not hilarious? As I write this, I cannot help wondering what would happen if Jono met Janeway or Seven of Nine. More fan fiction for others to write. I have never seen so many women in sickbay as when the Tellarians were being treated for radiation burns. If I were Tellarian in this situation, I would freak out and start howling too. I hate Beverly Crusher for automatically assuming that Jono had been tortured by his captors. We are the Federation. You will conform to our standards and morals or be judged as inferior. For reasons comedic, Jono must share Picard's quarters. And as everyone knows, teenagers play loud, discordant music that really annoys their parent or guardian. This will come up again in the Voyager episode Real Life. Oh, I forgot about that. That's even worse. Anyway, my mom could have told you how annoyed she was when I used to play the Cure album Pornography. Instead of taking Jono to play a racquetball, why doesn't Picard take him to the holodeck and run a Tellarian program to try to get Jono to relax? And that is my problem with this episode. Nobody asks Jono what he wants to do, and no number of good intentions and ice cream sundaes flicked in Wesley Crusher's face can save this episode. Though I was touched when Jono took his gloves off and said goodbye to Picard in the Tellarian fashion. 6 admirals named after Irish counties out of 10. Anyway, I personally think blasting 9 Inch Nails is more annoying to the parents than The Cure, but that's just me. What else have we got here? I don't know, because it's funny that Brandon had almost the opposite conclusion that Steven did about the Federation being, interfering with other cultures. I mean, at first they kind of were, but ultimately they did decide to respect it, so it did kind of contradict what Michael Eddington said about them wanting to assimilate everyone, because if that were true, they definitely wouldn't have given Jono up. And as I said, I understand why they would want to keep him, because he was in fact a human who was taken against his will by the very same people who killed his parents. So I'm going to have to side with Steven on this one. I think it's completely reasonable the way they reacted, but they did make the right decision in the end. Yes. What else was there? Yeah, Beverly, as I said, her assuming that Jonah was tortured to me makes a lot of sense. I think that was a good assumption or to make, or an understand, not a good one, an understandable one, I should say. That's probably the better word. And I've heard other people express the opinion that Worf should have been the one to bond with Janu and not Picard. And that definitely would have been a different dynamic, and it might have made more sense because Worf was more from a warrior race. But I think the counter that I heard to that is why the writers wouldn't want to do that is because it would be too similar to the episode Bonding, where Worf bonds with a young kid. I personally think it would be different enough. But I do think the main reason why they chose Picard is because he's the captain and the main character, and it wouldn't be funny, as Brandon points out, because he hates kids and he has to relate with a kid. Wouldn't that be fun? Yeah, it's not. So, yeah. Anyway, last comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, "This is one of the better culture shock stories, definitely demonstrates a dilemma, and while like the Cardassians, the kid ends up with who we would see as either anti-Federation or patriarchal or typical systemic cultures, reveals the dilemma for the kid who has grown up and been brought up a certain way. Perhaps if these two systems got along, the kid would have had a chance to love his birth family and his adoptive family. But just like Cardassians, the question was, what was more humane? Even yes, he'd be in a culture that had really no respect for women. This story was ambitious enough that I admired how it told the dilemma and why Picard had to see that the most humane decision was to have Jonah continue to live with the other culture and very likely not during his lifetime ever be in touch with his born human one again, his human born one again. I found it powerful and revealed the true complexity of this situation, so I'll give it 8 rebellious, consistent yells out of 10. And yes, this ending was much more humane than the one of Cardassians when we get to that one. IMHO. Was that IMHO? I'm not sure what that one means. Anyway, yeah, we'll get the Cardassians. It's definitely a worse decision than what they did in Cardassians. Oh, and I forgot to mention from Brandon's comment that the moment where Picard, where Jonah took off his gloves and sort of gave Picard that loving embrace, that was a nice moment. That was a good way to end the episode. I think, maybe not entirely earned, but I think it was nice, and a little touching. But yeah, it's funny because Norman mentions that in both this episode and Cardassians, the young boy was given to the anti-Federation species, but the opposite is true for each episode, because in this episode he's given to his adoptive family, whereas in Cardassians he's given to his birth family, and I think that was the wrong decision. But I think Norman brings up a very good point, that had relations between the Federation and Talarians been better, he could have actually visited his home family. In fact, I believe if Picard, maybe the right decision for Picard to do, rather than trying to manipulate Jonah into wanting to stay, what he should have done is agree to return him immediately, but try to negotiate with Endor, being like, look, let's make, I know we don't really have much peace agreement, or they didn't mention if they have a peace treaty or not, but he should say, look, I know the relations between us aren't the best, but let's negotiate you allowing Jonah to visit his grandparents even though he will remain in your custody. Now, I can see how this might be problematic because Endor might be distrusting, maybe rightfully so. Well, if I let him see his grandparents, will you actually return him to me? But if the Federation agreed, assured them that they would, and then he could threaten to go to war with them like he's doing now if they didn't. If they went back on their word, then he would have an even greater reason to go to war with them. It was like, I allowed you to let him see his grandparents, but but you said he would return if he wants to return, and clearly he would still want to return. So yeah, I think that would have been the more reasonable thing to happen in this episode, but it wouldn't be as dramatic. So they got to do it this way for the drama, for the contrivances. Anyway, thank you, patrons, very much for your comments. So, my rating for Suddenly Susan, I want to say Suddenly Susan. That was like the sitcom in the 90s. Was it Brooke Shields in that? I can't remember. Anyway, not Suddenly Susan. My rating for Suddenly Human out of 10 is going to be a 6. Good. So this is, again, a rating that kind of decided on as I was making my review, because I wasn't sure where I was going to come down on this episode, because I historically remember not liking it and thinking it was really boring, but I appreciated it a little bit more, but still not entirely. I still have issues with it. Particularly the cliche-ness of, Picard has to look after a young boy even though he hates kids. It's not funny. And that does seem to be what most of the episode's about. But I think the moral dilemma of what to do is interesting, and I think they made the right decision in the end, and how they handled this complex situation actually made a lot of sense. And as Brandon pointed out, the scene where Jonah takes off his gloves and farewells Picard was a very touching scene. So that earns it at least a positive rating, in my opinion. But not much more than that. So I will give it a 6. Out of 10. So that is it for my review of Suddenly Human. So coming up next on my channel next Monday, I will be releasing my review for Remember Me. That's another episode I'm very curious to see where I'll come down on that, because when I was younger I used to love this episode. More recently as an adult I started to hate this episode, so I'm going to keep an open mind. We'll see how we feel about it this time around. And then on Wednesday, I'll be releasing a video for my top 25 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, covering specifically number 25 through 11, because I already did the top 10 on my channel, but I will just refresh your memory about the top 10, but I'll focus more on number 25 and 11 since I haven't done those yet. And then on Saturday, I'll be back for another review for Legacy, the whole Tasha Yar's sister episode. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out for many more Star Trek videos and many more videos on many other shows. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.